There was a $1 bolt inside a billion-dollar aircraft, and only one man saw it. What happened next would bring down an entire empire and force an industry to confront the truth it had spent years hiding. Ethan Caldwell had worked the factory floor at Redstone Aerospace for 10 years without missing a single inspection. He wasn't loud. He wasn't political. He wasn't the kind of man executives remembered at company dinners. But on the morning of the most important test flight in the company's history, Ethan looked at a bolt that everyone else had already approved, and something in his gut told him it was wrong. That instinct would cost him everything, and it would save hundreds of lives. If this story matters to you, hit like right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one has traveled. The morning of the Falcon X certification review arrived the way big mornings always did at Redstone Aerospace, with catering trays in the executive conference room, with freshly printed presentation folders that smelled like the copy machine had been running since midnight, and with a particular kind of tension that passed itself off as excitement. Ethan Caldwell noticed none of that. He was already on the factory floor by 6:15 before the caterers, before the military liaisons in their pressed uniforms, before the investors who would arrive in black SUVs and speak in abbreviated sentences about timelines and deliverables. Ethan was where he was every morning, walking the line, clipboard in one hand, coffee thermos in the other, moving through the hangar with the particular slowness of a man who understood that speed was the enemy of accuracy. The Falcon X sat at the center of Bay 7 like something out of a dream someone else had, long and angular and matte black, designed for altitudes where the air was thin enough to kill you without the aircraft even trying. It was a reconnaissance platform, meant to fly quietly above places where nobody wanted to admit American eyes were watching. Redstone had spent 11 years and somewhere north of $3 billion building it. The certification test scheduled for that afternoon was the last formal gate before the Department of Defense signed the final contract, a number with so many zeros that Ethan had stopped trying to hold it in his head when he first heard it announced. He wasn't thinking about the contract. He was thinking about the left side control assembly. It had flagged in yesterday's passive sensor sweep. Nothing dramatic, just a reading that sat 2 degrees outside the expected thermal range during a routine preheat cycle. Could have been the sensor. Could have been ambient temperature variation in the hangar. Could have been nothing. Probably was nothing. But Ethan had been doing this long enough to know that probably nothing was exactly the phrase that appeared in accident investigation reports, usually in the paragraph that began with, "in retrospect." He set his thermos on the rolling equipment cart and requested the inspection panel be opened on the control assembly housing. The technician who pulled it, a younger guy named Derek, who'd been on the floor maybe 14 months, stepped back and waited. Ethan didn't rush. He put on his magnifying loupe and leaned in close, working his way through the assembly the way a man reads a letter he's already suspicious about, carefully, without skipping. He found it in the third cluster from the primary actuator mount. A bolt. It looked right. Same head profile, same threading, same silver-gray color as everything around it. If you were walking past, if you were doing a visual check from 18 inches away, if you were a program manager who had already reviewed 17 sign-off sheets this week, you would not have stopped. You would have kept walking. Ethan stopped. He removed the bolt with deliberate care, placed it in a clean parts tray, and held it under the portable work light. The threading was correct. The dimensions were correct. But the head stamp, that small, almost decorative mark that identified the manufacturer and certification standard, was wrong. Not subtly wrong, not borderline wrong. Wrong in the way that told you this part had never been anywhere near an aerospace certification process. It was a commercial-grade fastener, the kind you could order in bulk quantities from an industrial supply catalog, the kind rated for standard mechanical stress in ordinary equipment, not for a reconnaissance aircraft designed to operate at Mach 0.95 at 70,000 feet, where temperature differentials across the airframe could exceed 300 degrees Fahrenheit within minutes of ascent, where vibration tolerances were calculated to fractions that didn't exist in the commercial hardware world. Ethan straightened up slowly. He looked at the bolt in the tray. He looked back at the aircraft. He looked at Derek, who was watching him with the expression of someone who had picked up on the fact that something wasn't casual anymore. "Who signed off on this assembly?" Ethan asked. Derek checked the board. Pre-certification sign-off came through Vane's office. Final approval was 2 days ago. Marcus Vane was the chief operations officer. His office handled the production schedule, supplier approvals, and the daily pressure of keeping Redstone on the timeline that Victoria Harrington had promised the Defense Department. He was not an engineer. He had a business degree from a university in the southeast that nobody at Redstone had attended, and he spoke about production milestones with the specific confidence of a man who believed that problems were fundamentally organizational rather than physical. Ethan set down the loop. He picked up his clipboard and wrote out the safety hold notation in clear block letters, then pulled the red warning tag from his kit and secured it to the assembly panel. The tag was a physical object, bright red, with a laminated surface designed to resist being overlooked. In 10 years on this floor, Ethan had placed it 7 times. 3 of those times, the finding had been corrected and production had resumed within 48 hours. Twice it had led to supplier audits. Once it had resulted in a 2-week line stoppage that had cost the company $4 million in schedule penalties. Each time, the tag had been correct. He photographed the bolt, the housing, the certification placard mounted to the assembly, and the surrounding components. He photographed the hold tag in place. He documented the time, the location, the part number on the bolt's catalog designation, and the certification number listed in the approved materials specification, the number that the bolt in his tray very clearly did not match. Then he walked toward the operations center to file the formal report. He got as far as the corridor outside Bay 7 before Raymond Chu, one of the production coordinators, caught up to him. Raymond was a decent guy, generally, competent, fair, the kind of person who remembered people's kids' names without being told twice. But Raymond's face that morning had the look of someone carrying something they didn't choose to carry. "Ethan," he kept his voice low even though the corridor was empty. "I heard you pulled a hold tag." "I did." "On the control assembly?" "Yes." Raymond exhaled through his nose. "This is the worst possible morning." "I know what morning it is," Ethan said. "Victoria is already in the building. The General's liaison team is scheduled for the facility walkthrough at 10. We have press credentialed for the observation deck. This thing goes sideways and— Raymond!" Ethan stopped walking and turned to look at him. "There's a commercial-grade fastener in the primary control assembly. It's not rated for the thermal and vibration conditions this aircraft will experience during the test. If that bolt fails, and the probability is not negligible, the control system loses alignment and the test ends in an emergency shutdown at minimum." He paused. "That's the optimistic scenario." Raymond stared at him. "You're sure?" "I have photographs, a removed sample, and the part number documentation." "Yes, I'm sure." Raymond rubbed the back of his neck. He looked down the corridor toward the executive area, then back at Ethan. He looked like a man who understood that the correct path and the easy path had just separated completely, and he was being asked to decide which road he was on. "File your report," Raymond said finally. "I'll let Vane's office know." "I'm filing it regardless," Ethan said, and kept walking. The operations report hit Marcus Vane's inbox at 7:42. By 8:15, Vane was in the hangar, moving fast, wearing the particular expression of a man who has decided that the best strategy is forward momentum. He was built like a former athlete gone slightly soft, with thick forearms and a way of taking up physical space that communicated authority without requiring him to announce it. He found Ethan near the inspection station, still documenting. "Caldwell?" No greeting, no pleasantries. "Walk me through what you found." Ethan walked him through it. He showed Vane the photographs, the removed bolt, the specification sheet. He explained the thermal differential problem in plain language, no jargon, the way he always tried to explain technical findings to people who came at them from business angles. Vane listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set. When Ethan finished, Vane was quiet for a moment. "The sensor sweep that flagged this," he said. "How reliable is that system?" "Reliable enough that it caught this. It's flagged false positives before." "The sensor wasn't wrong. The bolt is right here." Vane looked at the bolt in the tray. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers. He was doing the thing that people who weren't engineers sometimes did, examining a physical object as if the examination itself might change what it was. "This could have come from the initial assembly and never caused a problem," he said. "Could have been in there through all the previous testing cycles." It wasn't in there through all the previous cycles, Ethan said. The subassembly for this section was rebuilt after the October stress testing identified frame flex issues. That rebuilding happened 6 weeks ago. The parts inventory for the rebuild came from the emergency procurement order. Vane put the bolt back in the tray. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like the recognition of a problem he had hoped wouldn't surface. "I want a second inspector on this," Vane said. "That's absolutely within your authority," Ethan said. "The hold tag stays while that happens." Vane looked at him for a long moment. "You understand what today is." "I understand what that aircraft is supposed to do," Ethan said. "And I understand what happens to the people inside it if the control system fails. There are no people inside it today. It's an unmanned test. There are people inside the test facility. There are people on the ground below the flight path. And in 18 months there will be a crew in that aircraft, or there will be a remote operator whose ability to bring it home safely depends on that control system functioning exactly as designed." Ethan kept his voice level. Not cold, just steady. "That bolt is not the certified component. That is the only fact I'm working from." Vane looked at him like a man reading a document he didn't like the conclusion of. "Get me a second inspector," he said, and walked away. Bummed. The second inspector was Carl Briggs, 15 years with Redstone, technically sound, a man who had spent the last several years quietly transitioning toward quality management roles that kept him further from the production floor and closer to the kind of meetings where things got decided rather than fixed. Carl was not a bad inspector. He was just a man who had learned over time which way the wind was blowing before he committed to a direction. He examined the assembly for 22 minutes. He reviewed Ethan's photographs and documentation. He looked at the bolt. He looked at the specification sheet. Then he looked at Ethan, and there was something apologetic in his expression that told Ethan everything before Carl said a word. "I'm going to document this as an anomalous finding pending further review," Carl said. "Given the timeline, I think we can probably proceed with the test under enhanced monitoring and address the certification discrepancy in the post-test audit process." Ethan stared at him. "That's not a procedure that exists. There's interpretive latitude in the certification protocols. Carl." Ethan kept his voice quiet because there were 2 technicians nearby, and he wasn't interested in making this any bigger than it already was. "That bolt is not certified for this application. There is no interpretive latitude in that fact. Either the part meets the specification or it doesn't." "I understand your concern. Then explain to me how we proceed with a flight test on a control system containing a non-certified component." Carl didn't answer that. He wrote something in his documentation and left without making eye contact again. By 9:30, Ethan's hold tag was still on the assembly, and Victoria Harrington was in the building. He knew she was coming before he heard her. There was a particular shift in the floor's atmosphere that preceded her appearances, a straightening of posture, a lowering of voices, a general rearrangement of people who wanted to be useful rather than in the way. Victoria Harrington had built Redstone Aerospace from a mid-tier defense contractor into one of the most recognized names in the industry, and she had done it through a combination of genuine strategic intelligence and a near-complete unwillingness to accept the word no as a final answer. She was 54, sharp-featured, with gray threading through dark hair that she'd stopped fighting somewhere around the time Redstone stock first crossed $100. She dressed like someone who understood that appearance was a tool and had simply gotten efficient at deploying it. And she moved through the factory floor the way powerful people move through spaces they owned, without hurrying, without uncertainty, with the specific kind of attention that made the people around her feel simultaneously seen and evaluated. She came with Marcus Vane and 2 people from legal. She stopped in front of the Falcon X. She looked at the red hold tag, and then she looked at Ethan Caldwell. "You're the inspector who filed the hold," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Ethan said. "Show me what you found." So Ethan showed her. He laid it out the same way he had for Vane, methodically, clearly, without editorializing. The bolt, the photographs, the specification mismatch, the thermal differential risk. He put the removed fastener next to the spec sheet illustration of the certified component and showed her the differences in the manufacturer's stamp. Victoria listened. She asked 2 questions. Both technical, both precise, which told Ethan that she actually understood the engineering even if she spent most of her time above it. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the bolt. "What's the failure probability?" she asked. "I can't give you a precise number without modeling it," Ethan said. "What I can tell you is that the commercial grade of this fastener is not rated for the vibration and temperature conditions that occur at this aircraft's operational parameters. Under sustained test conditions, especially in the high vibration profile scheduled for this afternoon's endurance sequence, there is a non-trivial probability of fatigue failure." "Non-trivial," she repeated. "It means I can't tell you it won't fail." Victoria looked at the aircraft. She looked at Vane. Something passed between them that Ethan couldn't fully read. Not a look of surprise exactly, but something more like the quiet acknowledgement of a conversation they'd already had elsewhere. "Mr. Vane tells me this component has been through 6 weeks of subassembly testing without incident," she said. "Previous testing didn't include the full endurance vibration sequence," Ethan said. "That's what's scheduled for this afternoon. And your recommendation is to halt the certification test." "My recommendation is to replace the component with the certified part before proceeding. That's it. That's the entire ask." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. There was something calculating in her expression. Not hostile, not yet, just the particular mental arithmetic of a person weighing competing variables. Then she looked at the hold tag, and her expression shifted, and Ethan recognized the shift for what it was. She had made a decision. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice had changed, still controlled, but with an edge under it now, the edge of someone who had decided the conversation was over. "I appreciate your diligence, but I have the Secretary of Defense's liaison team arriving in 40 minutes. I have a billion-dollar contract that represents 11 years of this company's work, and I have 18 other engineers who have reviewed this aircraft and signed their names to its readiness." She paused. "One inspector's concern about a $1 bolt is not sufficient grounds to halt this program." Ethan looked at her. "With respect, it's not about what the bolt costs. It's about what it's rated for. Mr. Vane will coordinate a post-test audit of the procurement records. That will address any supply chain irregularities." "The test is the problem," Ethan said. "After the test, the audit is a historical document." Victoria turned to Vane. "Get me the updated readiness status from the lead engineer." Ethan spoke again, and he kept his voice level, kept it clean of anything that could be characterized as insubordinate or emotional, because he understood that tone was going to matter here. "I can't remove the hold tag. Under Company Safety Protocol Section 14, Subsection 3, an inspector's hold can only be cleared by the safety director or by the inspector who placed it. I didn't write that rule. The company wrote it. But it's the rule I operate under." Victoria looked at him with something that might, in a different context, have been respect. In this context, it was simply acknowledgement, the acknowledgement of an obstacle that had declined to move. "Then I'll speak with the safety director," she said. The safety director was a man named Gerald Park, who had been with Redstone for 21 years and who Ethan had always considered a decent, principled person. Gerald had also, in the past 3 years, watched 2 of his predecessors leave the company under circumstances that were never fully explained. He had a daughter starting college in the fall. He had a pension that vested in 26 months. Gerald Park cleared the hold tag at 10:17. Ethan found out when he returned from filing his second formal documentation and saw that the tag was gone. He stood in front of the open inspection panel for a moment. Then he took out his phone and called the company's external safety reporting line. Not the internal one, the external one. The one that fed directly to the Federal Aviation Administration's Defense Contractor Oversight Program. He reported the finding. He provided the part number, the specification reference, the photographs, and the documentation of the hold tag clearance. He gave his name and his employee identification number. He answered 3 questions from the intake officer on the other end. The whole process took 9 minutes. Then he closed the inspection panel, picked up his clipboard, and went to find Marcus Vane. He found him outside the executive corridor near the elevators. "I filed an external safety report," Ethan said. "I want you to know that before the test begins." Vane's expression went through several things in about 2 seconds. You filed with the FAA Oversight Program. Yes. Ethan. Vane's voice dropped, and something came into it that might have been genuine. Do you understand what that does? That triggers a mandatory review process. It will delay. The review process doesn't automatically halt the test. You know that. The question of whether to proceed is still with the company. I've just created a record. Vane looked at him for a long time. You're making an enemy today that you can't afford. I'm not trying to make an enemy, Ethan said. I'm trying to make a record. He walked back to his inspection station, sat down, and began writing the most detailed documentation of his professional career. Every photograph, every measurement, every conversation, every time and name and decision laid out in the precise, declarative language that quality systems are built on. At 10:45, Marcus Vane appeared at his station. You're terminated, Vane said, effective immediately, insubordination and violation of confidentiality protocols. Ethan looked up from his documentation. He had expected something like this, though perhaps not this fast, and the speed of it told him something about how afraid they were. I'll need the termination in writing, he said. You'll get it. Security will escort you from the building. Ethan saved his documentation files to the personal drive he'd connected before starting his report, closed his laptop, and stood up. He picked up the parts tray with the non-certified bolt, his documented sample, properly logged and photographed, and placed it inside the sealed evidence bag he'd prepared when he first removed it from the assembly. He labeled it in front of the security officer now standing at his station. That part is company property, the security officer said. It's part of my safety report filing, Ethan said, which means it's subject to the external safety documentation hold I filed with FAA Oversight this morning. You can contact the legal department to verify that if you need to. The security officer looked uncertain. He made a call on his radio. There was a pause. Then he waved Ethan through. Ethan walked out of the building into the thin morning light, the evidence bag in his hand, his badge already demagnetized before he reached his car. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment and looked at the bolt through the transparent plastic of the bag. $1.32, catalog price, purchased in bulk from a commercial supplier whose invoices he had already photographed. He drove home. He made coffee. He sat at his kitchen table and looked at everything he'd documented and thought about what came next. Somewhere behind him, across the city, inside a factory full of people who had decided that a deadline was more important than a detail, the Falcon X was being prepared for its certification test, and Ethan Caldwell, the man no one had listened to, had already made sure that when the truth eventually surfaced, and he knew, in the way that people who've spent their lives paying attention always know, there would be a record of exactly who had seen it first. The coffee at Ethan's kitchen table went cold while he sat there reading back through everything he'd written. It was past noon. The certification test was scheduled for 2 o'clock. He had no way of knowing whether his external report had triggered any kind of contact with the company, whether anyone at FAA Oversight had even opened the intake filing yet, whether any of it mattered in the immediate sense. The bureaucratic machinery that handled these things moved on its own clock, and its clock had never once been calibrated around someone else's urgency. He ate half a sandwich without tasting it, and thought about Carl Briggs, who had stood in front of that bolt and written anomalous finding pending further review as if language could reclassify physical reality. He thought about Gerald Park, who had cleared the hold tag and gone back to his office and probably spent the rest of the morning convincing himself that it had been the right call. He thought about Raymond Chu, who had told him to file his report and then stepped back from everything that followed with the careful neutrality of a man who wanted to stay employed. None of them were villains. That was the thing that was hardest to sit with. They were people who had looked at a problem and then looked at everything surrounding the problem. The careers, the contracts, the years of work, the enormous institutional momentum of a program this size, and they had made the calculation that most people made when the cost of being right was this high. Ethan didn't feel superior to them. He felt tired. His phone had been quiet since he left the building. He'd expected that. What he hadn't expected was the call that came at 12:47 from a number he didn't recognize, and when he answered it, the voice on the other end belonged to a woman who introduced herself as Sandra Okafor from the FAA's Defense Contractor Compliance Division. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I'm following up on the safety report you filed this morning. I have a few questions." Go ahead, he said. She asked about the part number discrepancy, about the specific location in the assembly, about the chain of sign-offs he documented, about the timeline of events from his initial finding to his termination. She asked the questions the way people in her position ask questions, not leading, not skeptical, just systematic, moving through the details in an order that told Ethan she was building a picture rather than confirming one she already had. "What's the status of the test?" she asked toward the end. "Scheduled for 2 o'clock as far as I know. I haven't had contact with anyone at the company since I left." There was a pause. He heard her typing. "The report has been logged and flagged," she said. "Whether it triggers an immediate hold on the test is a determination that gets made above my level. I want to be transparent about that." "I understand," he said. "Is the documentation you referenced in the report, the photographs, the certification records, the procurement paperwork, can that be made available to us?" "I'll send everything I have within the hour." After he hung up, he spent 40 minutes organizing and transmitting files. Then he sat back and understood, with the particular clarity that comes after a period of sustained action, that he had done everything available to him. The next moves belonged to other people, to processes and decisions and institutional responses that were outside his reach. He was a former employee sitting at a kitchen table with a bolt and an evidence bag, and the aircraft was either going to fly its test or it wasn't, and his ability to influence that had reached its limit. He didn't feel peaceful about this. He felt like a man who had pushed a heavy thing as far as he could push it and had run out of ground. He was on his second cup of reheated coffee when his former colleague, Dana Whitfield, texted him at 2:19. Dana ran the calibration lab on the second floor of the facility. She wasn't part of the certification team, but she had sightlines to the test bay monitoring feeds, and she and Ethan had worked alongside each other for 6 years, long enough to have developed the particular shorthand of people who trusted each other without ceremony. Her text said, "Test is running. Everything looks clean so far. Where are you?" He typed back, "Home. Let me know if anything changes." 3 minutes later, she texted again, "Why did they let you go? People are asking." He didn't answer that one. He set the phone down and looked out the window at the street, which was ordinary and quiet in the way that streets are on weekday afternoons, people walking dogs. A delivery van double parked in front of the dry cleaner across the block. The ordinary world, continuing its business while somewhere across the city, a billion-dollar aircraft climbed through its test sequences. His phone buzzed again at 2:41. Not Dana this time. The number was Marcus Vane's direct line. Ethan looked at it through 2 full rings. Then he answered, "Vane. We need you back in the building." Vane's voice was different than it had been that morning. The forward momentum was gone. What was left was something stripped down, and it took Ethan a moment to identify it because he hadn't heard it from Vane before. It was fear. "The test is running," Ethan said. "The test has been suspended. There's been an anomaly in the control system monitoring." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the delivery van pulled away from the dry cleaner. "What kind of anomaly?" he asked. "I need you in the building, Ethan." "I was terminated 4 hours ago." A pause. "That's being reviewed." "I need to hear from someone with the authority to reinstate my access before I come back to that facility," Ethan said. "And I need it in writing." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll have something to you in 20 minutes. Ethan put down the phone and looked at the evidence bag on the table. The bolt sat there, the way small things sit when they've become significant, unchanged, ordinary-looking, completely indifferent to what it had set in motion. The written reinstatement came through in 18 minutes, signed by Gerald Park with a CC to legal. Ethan read it twice, sent a copy to his personal email, then picked up the evidence bag and his documentation files and drove back to Redstone. The facility's atmosphere had changed completely. The investors' cars were gone from the executive lot. The military liaison vehicles were still there, which was notable because it meant the government representatives hadn't left, which meant they were either waiting for answers or extracting them, and neither was good for the company. Security waved him through without the usual badge process, which told him that Vane had smoothed the path personally, and the fact that Vane had done it in 18 minutes told Ethan something about how bad the anomaly was. He found Vane in the monitoring center outside Bay 7, Standing with two engineers Ethan recognized from the certification team, and a woman he didn't know in a gray blazer who had the bearing of someone from the government side. The screens on the monitoring wall showed frozen telemetry readouts from the test. Vane saw him and crossed the room. "The vibration sequence at the 40-minute mark," Vane said, keeping his voice low. The control system showed a lateral alignment deviation. It was small, within what the automated systems flagged as a correctable variance, but it kept recurring at the same frequency interval. "The bolt," Ethan said. "We don't know that yet." "Marcus?" Ethan looked at him. "What's the interval?" Vane glanced at the screen. "Every 11 seconds, roughly, consistent with the primary resonance frequency of the vibration test sequence." Ethan knew that frequency. He knew what the certified fastener was rated to absorb at that frequency, and what a commercial-grade substitute would do instead. Not fail immediately, probably, but flex fractionally, and then flex again, and each cycle would leave the metal incrementally less resistant than the cycle before it, until the accumulated fatigue reached the threshold and the flex became a crack, and the crack became a failure. "You need to pull the assembly," Ethan said. "Right now, before anything else. Pull it and inspect the fastener in place." "That's a 12-hour process. It's faster than a crash investigation." The woman in the gray blazer had drifted closer during this exchange. She looked at Ethan directly. "You're Caldwell? The inspector who filed this morning?" "Yes." "Audrey Lawson," she said. "I'm the compliance coordinator for the DoD program office assigned to the Falcon X contract. I've been in contact with FAA oversight since this afternoon." She said it without inflection, just information, but the weight of it was clear. The program office and the FAA talking to each other on the same day on the same aircraft was not a conversation that ended quietly. "I'd like to see your original documentation," she said to Ethan. "I'll send you everything I transmitted to FAA oversight. Same files." She nodded. Then she looked at Vane. "I'd strongly recommend halting all further testing and securing the aircraft pending a full materials audit. That's not a formal order at this point, but it's a strong recommendation, and I'll be documenting that I made it." Vane looked like a man standing at the edge of something he could no longer walk back from. "I'll contact Ms. Harrington," he said. "You do that," Audrey Lawson said. But Victoria Harrington arrived at the monitoring center 20 minutes later, and this time there was nothing of the morning's controlled authority about her entrance. She moved with the same precision, but beneath it was something pulled tight, the look of someone who had been managing a problem and had just been informed that the problem had grown faster than the management. She took in the room, Vane, the engineers, Lawson, Ethan standing near the documentation terminal with his files open on the screen. Her eyes settled on Ethan for a moment that was hard to read. Then she looked at Lawson. "Ms. Lawson," she said, "I want to be fully cooperative with your office. If there are concerns about the test data, we'll address them directly." "I appreciate that," Lawson said. "I'd like your team to walk me through the telemetry from the 40-minute mark." "Of course." Victoria turned to the engineers. "Pull it up." While they did, she moved to stand near Ethan. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "You called the FAA before you left the building." "I filed an external safety report, yes." "While you were still employed here?" "While I still had an obligation to report what I found through every available channel, yes." She was quiet for a moment. On the screen, the telemetry readout from the 40-minute mark appeared, and the deviation pattern was visible even to someone reading it quickly. A rhythmic irregularity in the lateral alignment data, subtle but consistent, repeating at the interval Vane had described. "That pattern," Ethan said, not loudly, not making a production of it, just naming what was there. "That's stress cycling, the fasteners flexing under load and returning, but each cycle is degrading the material tolerance. If the test had continued for another 30, 40 minutes, you wouldn't have had a deviation pattern. You would have had a component failure." One of the engineers, a man named Suresh, who Ethan had always respected for his directness, looked at the screen and then looked at Ethan and said nothing. But the way he looked said enough. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We should have the assembly inspected before drawing conclusions." Absolutely, Ethan said. I've recommended that since this morning. She turned and looked at him then, fully, and there was something in her expression that Ethan hadn't expected. Not quite regret, not quite anger, but something between them that was more complicated than either. He understood, looking at her in that moment, that she was not a stupid person, that she had looked at the situation this morning and made a calculation that turned out to be wrong, and that she knew it, and that knowing it didn't make the next several hours any easier to face. "Why did you come back?" she asked him. "After we terminated you." It wasn't a hostile question, it was a genuine one, which surprised him. "Because the problem is still here," he said, "whether I work here or not." She turned back to the screens. Didn't. By 7 o'clock that evening, the assembly had been partially opened by the inspection team, and what they found confirmed what the telemetry had suggested. The fastener had developed a hairline fracture along the shank, not fully failed, not yet, but compromised in the precise way that Ethan had described when he explained the thermal differential risk that morning. Another 30 minutes of sustained vibration testing and the fracture would have propagated through the full cross-section of the bolt. The control system would have shifted out of alignment mid-test. The aircraft, unmanned, would have lost stable flight control. The fail-safe protocols might have caught it. They might not have. The test profile included a sequence specifically designed to challenge those fail-safes, which meant the window during which the failure would have occurred was exactly the window during which the redundancy systems would have been under maximum load. Suresh laid it out for the group in the monitoring center, speaking in the flat, careful language of engineers delivering findings they wish were different. When he finished, the room was quiet. Audrey Lawson made a call from just outside the doorway. She was in there for 4 minutes. When she came back, she said to Victoria, "The program office is issuing a formal production hold pending a full materials audit. That's effective immediately." Victoria said, "I understand." That was all she said. She didn't argue, didn't negotiate, didn't deploy any of the considerable skills she had for making hard situations softer. She just said, "I understand," and looked at the frozen telemetry on the screen with the expression of a person confronting the distance between the decision they made and the decision they should have made. Vane, standing 2 feet from her, said nothing at all. Ethan collected his documentation from the terminal, shut down the files, and picked up his evidence bag. The bolt was still in there. His original sample, the one he'd pulled from the assembly that morning and photographed and labeled and refused to leave behind. He was heading for the exit when Suresh fell into step beside him. "For what it's worth," Suresh said quietly, "we should have listened this morning." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I signed the readiness certification last week. I didn't catch the procurement substitution." Ethan looked at him. Suresh was a careful, serious engineer who had been with Redstone for 12 years, who didn't make careless mistakes, who believed in the work the way people who got into aerospace for the right reasons believed in it. "The substitution happened after the final engineering sign-off," Ethan said. "The emergency procurement order came through Vane's office 6 weeks ago. It went around the standard materials approval chain." Suresh absorbed this. "How many parts?" "I don't know yet. That's what the audit will tell us." They walked through the main corridor together, past the framed photographs of Redstone aircraft going back 40 years, past the company mission statement mounted behind glass near the executive wing entrance, past the empty reception desk where the caterer's coffee service had been set up that morning. "What happens to you now?" Suresh asked. Ethan thought about it for a moment. He didn't have a clean answer. His reinstatement had been procedural and temporary, something Vane had arranged to get him back in the building, and its status beyond tonight was unclear. He didn't have a lawyer yet, though he understood he was going to need one. He had the documentation, the external filing, the evidence sample, and the recorded fact that he'd been terminated within 4 hours of placing a safety hold that had now been validated by the telemetry data and the fractured fastener sitting in a tray inside Bay 7. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. Suresh nodded. They reached the lobby and Suresh stopped, extending his hand. Ethan shook it. He pushed through the main doors into the parking lot. The evening had cooled and the air outside smelled like exhaust and cut grass from somewhere nearby. A few news vehicles were parked along the service road. Someone had leaked something, or the presence of the military liaison vehicles had attracted attention, or both. A woman with a camera crew was doing a stand-up near the facility's main entrance sign. Ethan walked to his car without looking at them. He put the evidence bag on the passenger seat, the same place it had ridden that morning on the way home. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Somewhere inside that building, Audrey Lawson was on another phone call. Somewhere inside that building, Victoria Harrington was managing the worst evening of her professional life. And somewhere in a supply chain that ran through multiple vendors and procurement orders and altered invoices, there was a trail that the audit was going to follow, and Ethan understood enough about how these things worked to know that when they followed it, what they found was not going to stop at one bolt. He drove home through the evening traffic, the city doing what cities did, moving, indifferent, full of people whose nights were entirely their own. He thought about the fractured fastener in the tray and the deviation pattern on the telemetry screen. He thought about the 11-second interval, regular as a heartbeat, that had given everything away. He thought about how close it had been. Not close in the dramatic way that people imagined when they thought about near misses, no explosion, no wreckage, no visible catastrophe. Just a number on a screen repeating its small warning until someone with enough access and enough knowledge was willing to read it for what it was. He got home, made dinner, and ate it at the kitchen table across from the evidence bag. His phone had 17 unread messages and 4 missed calls, none of which he addressed that night. There would be time for all of it. The lawyers and the journalists and the investigative processes and the formal hearings were all out there in the near future, assembling themselves in the way that institutional consequences assembled when something this large began to come apart. Tonight, Ethan Caldwell washed his dishes, left them to drain, and went to sleep earlier than he had in years. He had done what he came to do. What the morning brought was the morning's problem. The audit team arrived on a Tuesday, 6 days after the test suspension, and they came the way serious investigations always came. Quietly, with too many cardboard boxes and not enough small talk. Ethan wasn't there for their arrival. He was sitting in the offices of a labor attorney named Patricia Dwell on the 14th floor of a building 12 blocks from Redstone, going through his termination documentation for the second time that week. Patricia was a compact woman in her late 50s who had spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of work and had developed, over that time, the specific manner of someone who had heard every version of every story and was now primarily interested in what could be proven. She read through his files without comment for a long time. Ethan sat across from her and drank the coffee her assistant had brought him and watched the city through the window behind her head. "They terminated you 4 hours after you placed the hold," she said finally, not looking up. 3 hours and 52 minutes. And the hold was subsequently validated by telemetry data and physical inspection of the component. "Yes. And your external safety report was filed prior to termination, while you were still an employee." "Yes." She set down the folder and looked at him over her reading glasses. "Mr. Caldwell, I want to be straightforward with you. The wrongful termination case is strong. The whistleblower protection claim is strong. But I want you to understand that strong cases against companies with the resources Redstone has tend to get long before they get resolved, and long is expensive in ways that aren't just financial." She paused. "Are you prepared for that?" Ethan thought about the fractured bolt in the evidence bag, which was now in a secure storage unit Patricia's office had arranged. He thought about the 11-second interval on the telemetry screen. "What's the alternative?" he asked. "Settlement, early, quiet, with a number attached and a non-disclosure attached to the number." "And the audit?" "The audit happens regardless of what you do. That's between the company and the government. Your choices only affect your piece of it." He looked at the folder on her desk. "I'm not interested in quiet," he said. Patricia nodded, once, with the expression of someone who had expected this answer and had already begun adjusting her strategy accordingly. "Then we proceed formally. I'll file the wrongful termination claim this week and put the whistleblower protection documentation on record before the audit produces findings that everyone will want to position themselves relative to." "Do it," Ethan said. He left her office and walked back to his car through the kind of November cold that came in from the north and meant it. He sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with the accumulated weight of the past week. He had not slept well. He was eating irregularly. His sister had called twice and he had answered once, briefly, and she had understood from his voice that he was not available for the conversation she wanted to have, and had let him go without pressing. He was not, by any honest measure, doing fine, but he was doing what needed doing, which was a different thing entirely. The audit team was led by a woman named Constance Riordan, who held a senior position in the Defense Contract Audit Agency, and who had, over 17 years in that role, developed a reputation for being thorough in a way that made the lawyers at the companies she audited anxious from the moment she walked through the door. She was tall, unhurried, and carried a yellow legal pad that she wrote on in a small, precise hand that nobody outside her team had ever been able to read over her shoulder. She requested access to every procurement record from the previous 18 months. She requested the materials approval chain documentation for the Falcon X production run. She requested the supplier contracts, the invoicing records, the delivery manifests, and the internal communications related to the emergency procurement order that Marcus Vane's office had authorized 6 weeks before the certification test. Redstone's legal team spent the first 2 days trying to narrow the scope of what she could access. Constance Riordan spent those same 2 days filing the formal expansion requests that made the narrowing irrelevant. By the end of the first week, her team had identified 47 line items in the materials records where the certified component specification did not match the delivered part. By the end of the second week, that number had grown to 231. Not all of them were in critical systems. Some were in secondary support structures where the tolerance difference between the certified and commercial component was meaningful but not immediately dangerous. But enough of them were in places that mattered: control surfaces, load-bearing joints, thermal management systems. That the scope of what Redstone had done began to take on a shape that was considerably larger and considerably more deliberate than a single emergency procurement shortcut. Ethan learned most of this secondhand through Suresh, who had become a reluctant but consistent source of information about what was happening inside the building. They met twice at a diner 6 blocks from the facility, in a corner booth where Suresh ordered the same turkey sandwich both times and ate it like a man with something pressing on him. 231 parts, Ethan said, at the second of those meetings. As of yesterday, Suresh said, and Riordan's team is still working through the Q3 procurement records. They haven't finished. Ethan was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. How far back does it go? That's the question. Suresh lowered his voice, even though the booth next to them was empty. The emergency procurement order was 6 weeks before the test, but some of the substitutions in the Q3 records are older than that. 8 months? Maybe 10. The pattern in the documentation suggests it wasn't improvised. Who is approving the supplier invoices? That goes through Vane's procurement coordinator, a guy named Brennan. He's been with the company 4 years, came from one of the secondary suppliers, which... Yeah. Suresh picked up his sandwich and put it down again without biting it. Riordan's team pulled his email correspondence yesterday. Ethan looked at the table. The picture assembling itself in his mind was not complicated, just ugly. A supplier relationship that had gradually shifted from competitive bidding to preferential arrangement, with the cost savings flowing somewhere other than Redstone's bottom line, and the documentation adjusted just enough to keep the discrepancy from surfacing in routine review. The kind of arrangement that required at least one person inside the company who understood the approval chain well enough to manage what got seen and what didn't. Does Victoria know the scope? He asked. Suresh was quiet for a moment. I think she knows it's worse than she told the board. That's a different thing than knowing. Yeah. Suresh finally took a bite of his sandwich, chewed it, set it down. There's something else. Your original inspection report, the one you filed the morning of the test, before they terminated you. He stopped. What about it? The version that's in the company's internal system doesn't match the version you transmitted to FAA oversight. Ethan went still. They're not drastically different, Suresh said carefully. The core findings are the same, but there are sections where the language is softer, where your certainty about the specification mismatch is characterized as preliminary rather than confirmed, and the section where you documented Vane's response to the finding, that section is shorter in the internal version. Some of the specifics aren't there. Ethan set down his coffee cup. He looked at Suresh and understood, from the way Suresh was looking back at him, that this was not speculation. "How do you know this?" Ethan asked. Because Reardon's team pulled both versions and compared them. They found the discrepancy in the document metadata. The internal version was modified at 11:03 the morning of the test. You were terminated at 10:45. 18 minutes after he'd left the building, someone had accessed his inspection report in the company's internal system and changed it. Ethan sat with this for a moment. He felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite surprise, more like the cold recognition of a thing he should have anticipated, the understanding that when you threaten something large enough, the response is proportional. "Reardon has both versions?" he asked. "She has the metadata showing the modification. She has the FAA submission as the original, and she has the internal version as it currently exists." Suresh looked at him. "That's not a compliance problem anymore, Ethan. That's tampering with a federal safety report." The diner was quiet around them. A waitress refilled someone's coffee at the counter. Outside, the street traffic moved in the ordinary rhythm of a Thursday afternoon. "I need to call Patricia," Ethan said. "What?" Patricia Dwell called him back within the hour and listened to what he told her without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Send me Suresh's contact information and I'll have him connected with Reardon's office directly. This goes beyond the wrongful termination claim now." "I know." "Ethan," her voice shifted slightly, "I want to be clear about what you're holding. A 200-plus part substitution pattern, a modified federal safety filing, and a procurement chain with relationships that are going to look very bad when the money flows are traced. This isn't a company that cut a corner to make a deadline." She paused. "This is a company that built a system for cutting corners and then tried to clean up the record when someone noticed." "I know what it is," he said. "The investigation is going to get larger. A lot of people are going to be trying to manage their own exposure. Some of them will want to do that by making your original findings look like something other than what they were. They already tried that. They'll try harder. I need you prepared for that." He told her he was. He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he said it because the alternative was to say, "I'm a guy sitting in his kitchen wondering how an inspection finding became a federal investigation," and that wouldn't help either of them. 3 weeks into the audit, Constance Riordan requested a formal interview with Ethan. They met in a conference room at Patricia's office rather than at Redstone or any government facility, which was Patricia's arrangement and which Riordan had accepted without visible objection. Riordan came alone except for a junior auditor named Torres, who took notes on a laptop and said nothing throughout. She sat across from Ethan and Patricia with her yellow legal pad and asked her questions in the same unhurried, sequential way that Ethan imagined she asked all her questions, working through the timeline of the morning, the specific nature of his finding, the conversations he'd had with Vane and Victoria and Carl Briggs, the precise moment he'd decided to file the external report. "You filed before you were terminated," she said. "Yes, I wasn't sure the internal channels were going to hold the information." "Based on what?" "Based on the fact that Vane's first response to my finding was to ask for a second inspector rather than to pull the assembly, and based on the fact that the second inspector characterized a clear specification mismatch as a pending review item." He looked at her. "When the first instinct of the people above you is to manage the finding rather than correct it, the internal channels are not the safest place for the information." Riordan wrote something on her pad. "Mr. Caldwell, during your time at Redstone, were you involved in the original safety standards development for the Falcon X program?" The question was asked matter-of-factly, but Ethan understood what it was reaching toward. "Early in the program, yes," he said. "I was part of the team that developed the material certification requirements for the control system components. That work was done about 7 years ago, when the program was in its initial design phase." Riordan looked at him steadily. "So you were familiar with the certified component specifications because you helped write them?" "Among other reasons, yes." She made another note. Torres typed without looking up. Patricia sat with her hands folded and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. "The internal version of your inspection report," Riordan said, "the modified version. Is there anything in the original? The version you transmitted externally That the modification removed or softened that you consider particularly significant? Ethan had thought about this. He had compared the two versions line by line the night after Suresh told him about the discrepancy, sitting at his kitchen table with both documents open on his screen. There's a section in the original where I document Marcus Vane's response to my explanation of the thermal differential risk, he said. In the original, I noted that he appeared familiar with the emergency procurement order before I referenced it. He didn't ask me what procurement order I was referring to. He already knew which one. Reardon's pen stopped moving. She looked at him. In the internal version, Ethan continued, that observation is not present. The section describing his response has been reduced to a factual summary of the conversation without that detail. The room was quiet for a moment. That's a significant detail, Reardon said. I thought so, Ethan said. The investigation's findings became public in a way that investigations' findings usually became public. Not through any official announcement, but through the accumulated weight of what reporters could observe. The Redstone facility had been operating at reduced capacity for weeks. The military liaison vehicles came and went with increasing frequency. Legal representatives from 3 different firms were spotted in the parking structure on different days by a journalist from the regional business paper who had been paying attention since the test suspension. The story broke on a Wednesday morning, sourced to federal regulatory filings that had been entered into the public record and attributed to people familiar with the investigation who declined to be identified. It was factual and carefully hedged, the way stories about ongoing federal investigations were required to be, but the facts themselves were sufficient. Redstone Aerospace had supplied a defense reconnaissance platform with non-certified components in 263 identified locations. The procurement record showed a pattern of supplier substitutions over a 10-month period. Federal investigators were examining whether the substitutions had been disclosed to the government customer at any point in the production process. A former quality inspector had filed a safety report on the day of the scheduled certification test and had been terminated hours later. The internal version of his report had been modified after his termination. The modification had been identified through metadata analysis and was part of the active investigation. Marcus Vane's name appeared in the 4th paragraph, in connection with his authorization of the emergency procurement order. Victoria Harrington's name appeared in the 7th, in connection with the decision to proceed with the certification test after the safety hold had been cleared. Ethan read the story on his phone at the kitchen table. He read it twice, checking the facts against what he knew and finding it accurate in the ways that mattered. He sent it to Patricia without comment. She called him 12 minutes later. The board convened an emergency session this morning, she said. My contact says there will be an announcement by end of day. What kind of announcement? Leadership changes. She paused. Ethan, I also got a call this morning from Redstone's outside counsel. They want to begin settlement discussions. He thought about the conversation he'd had in her office 3 weeks ago, about quiet and about numbers and about what he was and wasn't prepared to accept. On what terms? He asked. They haven't specified yet. They wanted to know if you were open to a conversation. He looked out the window. The street was the same as it always was, ordinary and continuous, indifferent to all of it. I'm open to a conversation, he said, but they should know before we have it that I'm not interested in non-disclosure. Whatever we discuss, it has to leave the record intact. I'll tell them. After he hung up, he sat at the table for a while without picking up his phone or opening his laptop. The story was out. The investigation was proceeding under its own momentum now, moving through the company's records and relationships and decisions with the kind of thoroughness that Constance Reardon's reputation had promised, and her work had delivered. What happened next would happen in boardrooms and legal offices and federal proceeding rooms, in the particular language of those places, at the pace those places moved. Ethan had placed a hold tag on the morning of the test and been walked out of the building 4 hours later. Everything that had happened since had been the direct consequence of that one decision, filed in the right place, at the right time, with the right documentation, by a man who understood that the size of a mistake wasn't measured by the cost of the part that caused it. He got up and made breakfast. Scrambled eggs, slightly overdone, the way they usually came out when he was thinking about something else. He ate them standing at the counter, looking at the wall, thinking about 263 components, about 10 months of substitutions, about the invoice records that Brennan had managed, and the approval chain that Vane had overseen, and the tests that Victoria had decided to proceed with, despite every warning that had been placed in her path. He thought about what Suresh had said in the diner. That's not a compliance problem anymore. And he understood now, more fully than he had even then, that it never really had been. What it had always been, from the moment he held that bolt under the work light and read the manufacturer's stamp, was a question about what a person did when they saw something that everyone else had decided not to see. He rinsed his plate and put it in the rack and went to get dressed. He had a meeting with Patricia at 10, and after that, whatever the day brought. The truth was already in motion. It had been since 7:42 on the morning of the certification test, when his report hit the first inbox and began its slow, unstoppable work of becoming the record. The settlement conversation lasted exactly one meeting, held in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown office building that belonged to Redstone's outside counsel. Patricia had chosen the location deliberately. Neutral ground, but the kind of neutral ground that reminded everyone in the room that this was a legal proceeding and not a negotiation between friends. Redstone sent 3 people. Their lead outside counsel, a man named Hargrove, who had the practiced ease of someone who settled cases for a living and had long ago stopped being personally invested in any of them. A second attorney whose role appeared to be documentation, and a representative from the company's board, a man named Clifton Walsh, who sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing, and whose presence communicated that the board was paying closer attention to this particular matter than to most. Ethan sat across from them, with Patricia beside him and his documentation folder on the table in front of him, closed. Hargrove opened with what he characterized as a good faith acknowledgement. The company recognized that the circumstances of Ethan's termination had been handled poorly, that his safety findings had proven valid, and that Redstone was committed to addressing the compliance issues the audit had identified. He said all of this in the measured, slightly formal language of someone reciting positions rather than expressing them, and Ethan listened without interrupting. When Hargrove finished, he named a number. It was a significant number, the kind of number that was designed to end conversations before they became complicated. Patricia wrote it on her legal pad without reacting visibly. Ethan looked at it. "What's attached to it?" Ethan asked. Hargrove had a list. The primary attachment was a non-disclosure agreement covering the specifics of the settlement. There was also a mutual release of claims, which meant Redstone couldn't pursue him for the external safety filing or the information he'd provided to the audit team. And there was a standard non-disparagement clause, which meant he couldn't talk publicly about the company or its leadership in negative terms. "The audit findings are already public record," Patricia said. "The federal investigation is ongoing. A non-disclosure on the settlement terms is standard, but my client is not in a position to sign anything that constrains his ability to cooperate fully with the federal investigation, now or in the future." "Of course," Hargrove said. "Full cooperation with federal investigators is explicitly carved out." "And the non-disparagement clause," Patricia continued, "my client would need that narrowed significantly. He's not interested in making public statements about individuals. But if he's called to testify in any proceeding, federal, civil, or administrative, he can't be contractually limited in what he says." Hargrove looked at the second attorney, who made a note. "We can work with that language." It went on like this for an hour and a half, careful, procedural, conducted entirely in the language of legal positions rather than human ones. Ethan participated when Patricia indicated he should, and stayed quiet when she didn't. He was not particularly good at this kind of patience, but he had enough of it. Near the end, Clifton Walsh spoke for the first time. He was in his late 60s, a board member who had joined Redstone 12 years ago after a career in defense sector finance, and he addressed Ethan directly in a way that Hargrove had carefully avoided. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I want to ask you something outside the formal terms of what we're discussing here." He glanced at Hargrove, who didn't object. "Is there anything the company could do, structurally, not financially, that would matter to you in this resolution?" Ethan looked at him for a moment. He hadn't expected the question in this room, from this person, in this context. "Yes," he said. Walsh waited. "An independent safety reporting structure," Ethan said. "Not internal, not reporting to operations or the executive team. A quality and safety division with genuine authority to halt production, with its findings going directly to the board and to the government customer. And protection, real protection, for the people in that division, so that the next inspector who finds something doesn't have to choose between their job and their conscience. Walsh was quiet for a moment. He wrote something in his own small notebook, separate from the legal pads around the table. "That's not something I can commit to in this room," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not asking you to." They looked at each other across the table for a moment, two people who understood different things about the same company in the particular way that understanding accumulates from different positions within the same institution. "But I'm noting it," Walsh said. Ethan nodded. They didn't reach a final agreement that day. Patricia said afterward, walking to the parking structure, that this was normal and expected, that the next session would be where the real terms got worked out. Ethan told her to proceed as she saw fit and to call him when she needed him. What he didn't tell her was that the settlement, whatever it ultimately said, was not the thing that was keeping him up at night. The federal hearing was scheduled for the second week of December, 8 weeks after the test suspension. It was a formal administrative proceeding before a panel convened by the Defense Department's Inspector General, and its purpose was to establish the factual record of what had happened at Redstone, who had made which decisions, and what the appropriate regulatory and contractual consequences were. Ethan was not the first witness called. The panel spent the first 2 days with Constance Reardon's audit team, working through the 289 components. The number had grown again in the final audit, and the procurement records and the supplier relationships. They spent the third day with the engineers who had signed the readiness certifications, including Suresh, who answered every question he was asked with the kind of careful precision that Ethan recognized as the behavior of a man who had decided that the only way through this was straight. Marcus Vane testified on the fourth day, with his attorney present. Ethan wasn't in the room for it, but Patricia's contact gave her a summary. Vane had acknowledged authorizing the emergency procurement order. He had characterized the supplier substitution as a good-faith cost management decision made under production schedule pressure. When asked about the modification to Ethan's inspection report, he had stated that he had no direct knowledge of who had made the change. The panel had not visibly accepted this characterization. When the email records were introduced, Brennan's correspondence, recovered by the audit team from the company's server backup, the timeline they established was specific and damaging. Vane's procurement coordinator had been in contact with the substitute supplier before the emergency order was formally issued, which meant the decision had been made before the official record showed it being made. The cost differential between the certified components and the commercial substitutes over 10 months of production represented a figure that the panel's financial analysts characterized as substantial, and the question of where that differential had gone was one that the email records did not answer, but strongly implied was worth answering. Ethan was called on the 5th day. He came alone, or nearly. Patricia was present as his counsel but sat away from the witness table. He brought 3 items and placed them on the table in front of the panel: a printed copy of his original inspection report, the one he had transmitted externally, the failed fastener still in its labeled evidence bag, and a certified replacement component, the correct part, in a separate container. The panel chair was a woman named Admiral Denise Farrow, retired from active service, but clearly someone who still carried the particular economy of attention that came from decades of command. She looked at the items on the table before Ethan even began. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you placed a safety hold on the Falcon X control assembly on the morning of the certification test. Walk us through the basis for that decision." He walked them through it. He had done this before, for Reardon, for FAA oversight, for Patricia, for the documentation he'd been building since the day he left the building, and by now the account was precise without being rehearsed. He described the thermal sweep anomaly, the inspection, the part number discrepancy, the photographs, the specification comparison. He held up the evidence bag and the certified component side by side and explained the difference in the manufacturer's stamps, the certification standard designations, and the mechanical ratings. He explained what the thermal differential meant at altitude. He explained what the vibration profile of the endurance test would do to a commercial-grade fastener over time. He explained what the 11-second interval in the telemetry data represented. He was not performing. He was not constructing a narrative designed to make himself look good or the company look bad. He was doing what he had always done on the factory floor, describing what was there, in the plainest language available, without editorializing. One of the panel members, a civilian engineer named Dr. Patricia Shen, asked him a question that others had worked around without quite reaching. Mr. Caldwell, the record shows that you were part of the original team that developed the safety standards for the Falcon X control system components, approximately 7 years ago. That's correct? Including the specific certification requirements for the fasteners in the primary actuator assembly. Among other components, yes. Can you explain the significance of that in relation to your finding? Ethan looked at her. When I looked at that bolt under the work light and saw the manufacturer's stamp, I wasn't consulting a reference document to know it was wrong. I knew it was wrong because I was part of the team that decided what right looked like. He paused. The specification wasn't abstract to me. I knew why each requirement existed. I knew what failure mode each requirement was designed to prevent. When the stamp didn't match, I knew exactly what the mismatch meant. The room was quiet. Which is why, he continued, I found it difficult to understand how the component had passed the production review process. The certification requirements for that assembly are not ambiguous. They're specific, they're documented, and they're written in language that any qualified inspector would recognize. Are you suggesting the failure of the review process was deliberate? Dr. Shen asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his documentation folder. I'm suggesting that the review process produced a result that the documentation doesn't support, he said carefully. Whether that was deliberate or the result of a system that had been structured to produce that result, that's a distinction I don't think I'm the right person to draw. The audit record is better placed to answer that than my interpretation. Admiral Farrow made a note. She looked at the evidence bag, then at Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, you were terminated on the morning of the test after filing your safety report and before the hold tag was cleared. Is that correct? Yes. And you subsequently provided your documentation to federal oversight and cooperated fully with this investigation. Yes. Was there a point at which you considered not doing that? The question surprised him. Not because it was inappropriate, it wasn't, but because it was human in a way that administrative proceedings rarely allowed themselves to be. He thought about it honestly. He thought about the morning in the parking lot, the demagnetized badge, the evidence bag on his passenger seat. He thought about sitting at his kitchen table that afternoon, not knowing whether any of it would matter, not knowing whether Sandra Okafor at FAA Oversight would open the filing before the test ran, not knowing whether the records he'd preserved would reach anyone with the authority to use them. There was a point where I didn't know if it would make a difference, he said. That's not the same thing as considering not doing it. The record needed to exist regardless of what happened with it. Admiral Farrow looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said. Victoria Harrington testified the following day. Ethan was present for this session at the panel's request, seated in the gallery rather than at the witness table, because the panel had indicated they might ask him clarifying questions related to her testimony. She came in with 2 attorneys and sat with the composed, careful bearing of someone who had spent several weeks preparing for this exact room. She was dressed simply, without the projection of authority that her professional appearance usually carried. Whether that was strategic or genuine, Ethan couldn't determine, and he wasn't sure the distinction mattered. The panel took her through the morning of the test. She confirmed the sequence of events as the record showed them. Ethan's hold, Vane's request for a second inspector, the hold being cleared by Gerald Park, the decision to proceed with the certification. When Admiral Farrow asked about the decision to proceed, Victoria was precise. I was informed by my operations chief that the safety hold had been reviewed and cleared by the company's safety director, she said. I made the decision to proceed with the test based on that clearance. Were you informed of the nature of Mr. Caldwell's finding before you made that decision? A pause. I was present when he explained it. And your assessment of his explanation at that time? Another pause. This one was longer, and Ethan watched her face during it. Watched her arrive at something that looked, from where he sat, like the particular discomfort of a person who was being asked to be precise about something they had spent considerable effort, not being precise about. I considered his concern valid, but believed it had been appropriately addressed through the secondary review process, she said. Did you have concerns about the secondary review process? I had confidence in the safety director's judgment. Did you have concerns about the procurement records Mr. Caldwell referenced in his explanation? The pause this time was the longest yet. Her attorney leaned in slightly, but she didn't look at him. I was aware that the emergency procurement order had been processed under schedule pressure, she said. I was not aware at that time of the scope of the substitutions the order represented. Farrow looked at her. But you were aware there had been substitutions. I was aware the order had sourced components from secondary suppliers. And you did not investigate the certification status of those components prior to approving the test. It wasn't quite a question. No, Victoria said. The room held that answer for a moment. Ethan did not feel anything particularly triumphant about it. He watched her and felt something closer to what he'd felt looking at Gerald Park, at Carl Briggs, at Raymond Chu. The recognition of a person who had made a series of decisions that had each seemed, in the moment, like the manageable choice, until they weren't. The difference was the scale of what those decisions had been made about. After Victoria's testimony, during the recess, Ethan walked to the hallway for coffee from the machine near the elevator bank. He was standing there, cup in hand, when she came out of the hearing room with her attorneys. They moved toward the far end of the hallway, and he thought that was that. But she stopped, said something to her attorneys, who continued walking, and then she came toward him alone, which he hadn't expected. She stopped a few feet away. She looked tired in a way that her professional bearing couldn't entirely conceal. I owe you an apology, she said. Not loudly. Just two people in a hallway. Ethan looked at her. He thought about what to say and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't want to say anything cutting, not because he'd forgiven her in some clean, resolved way. He hadn't, not entirely. But because whatever was being offered in this moment, it wasn't nothing, and he'd spent enough time around people who couldn't offer even that. I know you believed what you were building mattered, he said. I think that's true. The aircraft matters, the program matters. That's not the part that went wrong. She looked at him for a moment. What went wrong, he said, is that the people around you convinced you, or you convinced yourself, that the details were someone else's department. She didn't respond to that. She looked at the floor for a second, then back at him. The structural proposal, she said. The Independent Safety Division. Walsh told me what you said in the settlement meeting. Okay, Ethan said. I'll support it with the board, for whatever that's worth at this point. He nodded. It's worth something, he said. She went back to her attorneys. He finished his coffee. The panel's preliminary findings were issued 3 weeks later, and they were, by any measure, comprehensive. The Falcon X contract was suspended pending full component replacement and recertification. Redstone was required to return a portion of the contract payments already received, pending negotiation of the recovery amount. Marcus Vane and 2 members of the procurement team were referred to the Department of Justice for investigation of potential fraud in connection with the supplier relationship and the document modification. Gerald Park received a formal administrative censure. Victoria Harrington was not personally referred for prosecution, but the findings noted, in language that was careful and devastating at the same time, that the decision to proceed with the certification test over an active safety concern represented a failure of executive responsibility that the board would need to address. The board addressed it 12 days later. Victoria Harrington resigned as CEO by mutual agreement. The statement released by the company described it as her decision, made in the interest of allowing the company's restructuring to proceed without distraction. Ethan read the statement and understood that the sentence was true in the specific, technical way that statements crafted by lawyers were true. All the words were accurate, and the picture they assembled wasn't. Suresh called him the evening the resignation was announced. "How are you feeling?" he asked. It was a simple question, and Ethan sat with it for a moment before answering. Like something finished, he said, not like something won. Suresh was quiet for a beat. Is there a difference? Yeah, Ethan said. There is. He wasn't sure he could fully explain it, even to himself. What he knew was that from the morning he'd placed the hold tag to this evening, he'd been moving through a process that had felt less like a fight and more like the sustained, grinding work of making a record accurate, of insisting, at each point where someone tried to alter or minimize or reclassify the truth, that the truth stay where it was. And now the record was what it was. The findings were in writing. The consequences were in motion. That wasn't the same as winning. Winning implied that what was lost was worth what it cost. He had a lawyer's bill he was still working through, a settlement that had been finalized the previous week with terms he could live with, and 10 years of institutional memory at a company he no longer worked at. He had missed his nephew's birthday dinner because he'd been preparing testimony. He had gone 3 weeks without sleeping through the night. What he had, on the other side of all of that, was a record that said what happened, and the slow, unglamorous, deeply imperfect process of correction that was now underway because the record existed. The board's meeting next week on the restructuring plan, Suresh told him. Walsh is pushing the independent safety division into the proposal. I heard, Ethan said, there's talk they'll want someone to design the framework, the criteria, the reporting structure, the authority protocols. A pause. Your name came up. Ethan looked at the kitchen table, at the empty space where the evidence bag had sat for weeks before he transferred it to Patricia's storage. The table looked ordinary without it. Just a table. Tell them I'll think about it, he said. He thought about it for 11 days. That was longer than Patricia had expected and shorter than his sister had hoped. His sister, whose name was Carolyn, and who lived 40 minutes away in a house with 2 kids and a husband who coached youth soccer and who had been watching Ethan navigate the past 3 months with the particular helpless concern of a person who loves someone they can't protect, had called him twice during those 11 days to suggest, gently and then less gently, that maybe what he needed was not to go back. You won, she said on the second call. The word landed the way it had when Suresh used it, imprecisely, but with genuine feeling behind it. You don't have to walk back into that building. I know I don't have to, he said. Then why are you considering it? He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being a longer conversation than either of them had the energy for. Because the thing I wanted fixed isn't fixed yet, he said. The investigation is done. The findings are in writing, but a document doesn't build a system. Someone has to build the system. Carolyn was quiet for a moment. And it has to be you. It doesn't have to be. But I know what the system needs to look like, and I know why, and I know the places it'll get pushed against and where it'll need to hold. That's not nothing. She didn't argue further. That was the thing about Carolyn. She didn't always agree with him, but she generally understood when he'd thought something through to the end. The call he made on the 11th day was to Clifton Walsh directly. Not to Hargrove or the legal team, not through Patricia's office. Walsh had given him his card in the hallway outside the hearing room the day after Victoria's testimony, with a quiet directness that Ethan had respected. Walsh answered on the second ring. I'll do it, Ethan said. But I need it structured the way I described in the settlement meeting. Independent reporting, direct board access, real authority to halt production, not advisory authority, actual authority, written into the company's operating charter. That's what the board approved last week, Walsh said. I want to see the language before I sign anything. I'll have it to you by end of day. He read it that evening at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten cold sandwiches and reheated coffee for 3 months, where he'd organized documentation and compared inspection reports and sat with the accumulated weight of what it cost to be the person who said the thing no one wanted to hear. The language in the charter amendment was good, not perfect. There were 2 sections where the wording left room for operational pressure to erode the division's independence over time, and he made notes on both of them and sent them back with proposed revisions. Walsh's team accepted both revisions the following morning. Ethan signed the consulting agreement on a Thursday in January in Patricia's office, with Patricia across the desk reading the final version one more time with the particular attention she gave to documents that would matter later. When she finished, she looked up and said, "This is solid," which from her was something close to enthusiasm. He drove to the Redstone facility that afternoon, For the first time since the day he'd left Patricia's storage unit with the evidence bag and closed the chapter on his formal involvement in the federal proceedings. The guard at the main entrance issued him a visitor badge. Not an employee badge, not yet. His formal start date was 2 weeks out. And he drove through the lot and parked in an ordinary space and sat for a moment looking at the building. It looked the same. Buildings always look the same. The restructuring had changed the interior in ways that were more visible than the exterior. The operations center outside Bay 7 had been reorganized, with the monitoring equipment reconfigured for the new inspection protocols that Reardon's team had recommended and the company had been required to adopt. Several offices that had belonged to people who were no longer there had been reassigned or left empty. The executive corridor felt different. Not quieter exactly, but less pressurized, the way a room felt after a window had been opened. Suresh met him in the main corridor, and they shook hands with the ease of two people who had been through something together and didn't need to discuss it to acknowledge it. The board wants a presentation on the division framework by end of February, Suresh said, falling into step beside him. Walsh specifically. He wants something he can put in front of the DoD program office to demonstrate the structural changes. I know. I'll have a draft in 3 weeks. There's also the staffing question. You're going to need people who report to you and not to operations. That's going to create friction. Yes, it will, Ethan said. You sound unbothered by that. Friction is fine. Friction means the structure is doing what it's supposed to do. He glanced at Suresh. What bothers me is a system that produces no friction at all, because it means no one's actually checking anything. Suresh nodded slowly, with the expression of someone filing that away. They walked through Bay 7, which was quieter than it had been in years. The Falcon X prototype was in a secured inspection bay undergoing the full component replacement that the panel's findings had mandated, a process that would take the better part of 4 months and cost the company more than the original supplier shortcut had saved by a factor that made the original decision look even more comprehensively stupid in retrospect. 2 technicians were working near the assembly platform, and they glanced up when Ethan came through. One of them, Derek, the younger one who had been at the inspection panel with him on the morning of the test, gave a small nod. Ethan nodded back. He stopped near the center of the bay and looked at the aircraft. It was the same machine it had been on the morning of the certification test, and it was also completely different, in the way that objects were different when you understood their history differently than you had before. The design was still sound. The engineering behind it was genuinely good work. Years of careful, talented effort by people who had believed in what they were building. What had compromised it had nothing to do with the aircraft itself and everything to do with the institutional culture that had surrounded its production. That was the part that Ethan had been carrying since the beginning, the part that was harder to explain than the bolt or the telemetry or the procurement records. The aircraft hadn't failed because of bad engineering. It had come within 40 minutes of failing because of a culture that had learned, gradually and then systematically, to treat the details as negotiable. He was thinking about this when Walsh found him in the bay, having apparently come directly from a board meeting given that he was still in his jacket and carrying a portfolio. Caldwell. Walsh extended his hand and Ethan shook it. Good to have you in the building. Good to be in the building for a reason I chose, Ethan said, which was more candid than he'd intended. But Walsh didn't seem bothered. Fair, Walsh said. He looked at the aircraft. How long do you think it takes to actually change the culture, not just the procedures? It was a real question, asked by a man who understood the difference, and Ethan took a moment before answering. Longer than anyone wants to hear, he said. The procedures you can change in months. You write them into the charter, you staff the division, you train people on the reporting process. That part is the straightforward part. He looked at the aircraft. The culture is the thing people do when they think no one is watching, or when the deadline is close, or when the person above them is communicating, not in words, but in what they reward and what they ignore, that the detail doesn't matter as much as the schedule. That takes years to change, and it changes only if the structure consistently demonstrates that the detail actually does matter, every time, without exception. Walsh looked at him. You sound like you've thought about this for a while. 10 years, Ethan said. He spent the first 3 weeks in a temporary office off the main engineering corridor, building the framework document from the ground up. Not from the investigation findings. Those were the diagnosis, not the cure. but from the original safety standards he'd helped write 7 years ago, from the inspection protocols that the industry had developed over decades of understanding what failure looked like at the component level, from the specific granular knowledge of where the Falcon X production process had been vulnerable and why. The framework was not complicated. The things that worked rarely were. It had 3 core elements: an independent inspection division staffed by people who reported to no one in the operational chain, with their performance evaluations conducted by the board's safety committee rather than by any executive. A formal safety hold protocol with defined criteria and a clear escalation path that could not be short-circuited by a single executive's authority. And a protected reporting channel that allowed any employee at any level to flag a safety concern without their identity being visible to the operations or executive team. That third element was the one that generated the most pushback during the review process. 2 of the board members felt it created liability exposure. One of them said, in a meeting that Ethan attended at Walsh's request, that it was an invitation for disgruntled employees to weaponize the system. Ethan sat through this and waited until Walsh nodded in his direction. "The system I'm describing," Ethan said, "is specifically designed to receive the kind of report that I filed on the morning of the certification test. If that report had been received through a protected internal channel, rather than requiring me to go externally, this company might have corrected the problem before a federal investigation made it a public matter." He looked at the board member who'd raised the liability concern. "The liability exposure the company faces from employees misusing a safety channel is considerably smaller than the liability exposure it faced from not having one." That was the end of the pushback on the third element. The framework document was presented to the board at the end of February. Walsh had asked Ethan to present it himself, and he did. Without slides, without elaborate visual materials, just the document and his ability to explain it, which he'd learned over 20 years of working with physical systems, was usually enough. The board approved it with 2 abstentions and 1 formal objection from a member who wanted the operational authority limitation narrowed. Ethan told Walsh afterward that the objection was fine, that it was in the record, and that if it ever became relevant again, at least everyone would know where each person had stood. Walsh looked at him with an expression that was partly amusement and partly something else. "You're not particularly diplomatic," Walsh observed. "No," Ethan agreed, "but I'm accurate." Patid. The division was staffed by April. 6 inspectors hired from outside the company, with no prior Redstone employment. Ethan had insisted on this because independence was meaningless if the people providing it had existing relationships with the operational leadership they were supposed to check. A director of safety documentation who had spent 12 years in aerospace compliance work and who came highly recommended by 2 people in the industry that Ethan trusted. And Dana Whitfield, who had spent months watching from the calibration lab and who had texted him on the morning of the test to tell him what she saw on the monitoring feeds, and who he had offered the deputy director position with the straightforward observation that he needed someone who had already demonstrated they would tell him what was actually happening. Dana had taken exactly 1 day to accept. "You know this is going to be the most thankless job in the building," she told him on her first official day. "I know," he said. "We're going to stop things people don't want stopped, and we're going to get blamed for the schedule impact, and nobody's going to write a story about us when nothing goes wrong." "That's exactly right." She looked at him. "You're okay with that?" "That's what working correctly looks like," he said. "Nobody writes stories about the bridge that didn't collapse." She shook her head, but she was already sitting down at her desk, already pulling up the component certification database he'd rebuilt as the foundation of the new inspection protocol, already doing the work. On a Tuesday morning in May, 7 months after the certification test had been suspended, and the world Ethan had known at Redstone had come apart and been put back together in a different shape, a small group gathered in the company's main training center on the 3rd floor. The training center was a plain room, presentation screen at one end, rows of seating, the particular institutional smell of carpet and recycled air that training rooms always had. It was used every week for new employee orientations, safety briefings, certification reviews. Ordinary, functional, unremarkable. Except that morning, near the side wall, a small display case had been mounted at eye level. Simple glass-fronted box, good lighting inside it, the kind of thing that took a facilities crew about 2 hours to install, and that looked like it had always been there. Inside the case was a bolt, not the fractured one that was still in federal custody, part of the evidentiary record of the investigation. This was a replica, manufactured to the exact specifications of the non-certified commercial fastener that Ethan had pulled from the Falcon X control assembly on the morning of the certification test. Below it, on a small card with clean typography, was a single line, $1.32, the cost of ignoring a small thing. Walsh had suggested the display. Ethan had argued briefly that it was too pointed, that it would feel like a permanent accusation to the people who had been involved. Walsh had said that was the point, and Ethan had thought about it for a day and concluded that Walsh was right, not as an accusation, but as a reminder, the kind of object that made a point more efficiently than any policy document because it was physical, because it could be held and looked at, because it was the kind of thing that stayed in a person's memory differently than words on a screen. The group that gathered that morning was small: Walsh, Suresh, Dana, a few members of the new inspection division, several engineers from the certification team, Derek the technician, and a handful of others who had been present in various ways during the months the story had unfolded. No press, no ceremony, no speeches. Walsh had suggested a formal unveiling event, and Ethan had said no, and Walsh, to his credit, had not pushed. Ethan stood near the display case and looked at the bolt and didn't say anything for a moment. He wasn't a man who was comfortable at the center of rooms. He never had been. He was comfortable at inspection stations and in documentation rooms and in the kind of quiet, specific conversation that two people had when they were both looking at the same problem and trying to understand it clearly. He was not comfortable being looked at, which was what was happening now, and he dealt with it the way he dealt with most discomfort, by paying attention to something specific instead. "The reason this is here," he said finally, to no one in particular and to everyone in the room, "isn't to make anyone feel bad about what happened. What happened is in the record. The investigation has its findings. The legal process has its outcomes." He looked at the bolt. "This is here because the thing that almost happened didn't happen because of a dramatic failure. It almost happened because of the accumulated weight of 100 small decisions to look past something that needed to be looked at directly." He glanced around the room. Suresh was watching him with the careful attention of someone who had been thinking about the same thing from a different angle for months. Derek was looking at the display case with an expression Ethan couldn't fully read. Every person in this building who works on something that eventually flies or floats or carries people. The margin between the thing that works and the thing that fails is almost never where you expect it to be. It's not in the big, obvious places. It's in the details that feel small enough to defer. The component that's close enough, the record that's approximate, the sign-off that happens because there's pressure and it's probably fine. He stopped. It's almost never fine in the ways that matter most. The room was quiet. The display is here so that when someone walks through for an orientation or a training session, or just because this is the building they work in, they see it. And maybe they think about what they signed off on last week, or what they're about to sign off on next week, and whether they actually looked at it. He paused. That's all. Walsh started to say something, and Ethan shook his head slightly, and Walsh, reading the room, let it go. They dispersed the way small groups dispersed from informal gatherings, gradually, in pairs, with the low-level conversation of people who have been in the same place for the same purpose and are now returning to the rest of their day. Dana touched his arm briefly on her way out, which was as much as either of them needed to say about it. Suresh stayed until nearly everyone else had gone. "How's it feel?" he asked. "About the same as everything else," Ethan said. "Like work that still needs doing." Suresh nodded. He looked at the bolt in the case, and his expression carried the particular weight of someone who had signed a readiness certification that the record would always show he'd signed, and who was going to carry that in the specific, unresolvable way that people carried the decisions they couldn't retroactively make differently. "The new inspection protocol," Suresh said. "It would have caught it." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's why it exists." They stood there for another moment, the two of them, in the ordinary training room with its carpet smell and its fluorescent lighting and the small glass case on the wall that held something worth $1.32, and whatever you decided that meant. "I have a certification review at 10, Suresh said. "Go," Ethan said. He stayed in the room alone for a while after everyone had left. He looked at the bolt and thought about the morning of the test. The cold hanger, the coffee thermos, the particular quality of the light in Bay 7 at 6:15 in the morning when the building was still mostly empty and the aircraft sat in the middle of the floor like a fact about what human beings were capable of building when they paid attention. He thought about what it had cost. Not in the legal or financial sense. Those were numbers, and numbers resolved. He thought about the nights he hadn't slept and the dinners he hadn't attended, and the version of his professional life that would have continued undisturbed if he had looked at that bolt and decided it was someone else's problem. He thought about all the people over all the years who had looked at things like that bolt and made exactly that calculation and been right. Nothing happened, the schedule held, the deadline was met, the problem stayed theoretical. He thought about the 40 minutes that had remained in the test when the control system deviation pattern began. The thing about catastrophic failures, the real ones, the ones that ended in wreckage and investigations and names on memorial plaques, was that they almost always had a version of this story buried somewhere in their history. A person who saw something. A system that made it too costly to say so. A chain of decisions, each one individually defensible, that assembled into an outcome nobody would have chosen if they'd seen it from the beginning. What Ethan had done was not heroic in the way that stories sometimes needed things to be heroic. He had done his job. He had done it when the people above him were communicating loudly and clearly that doing his job was inconvenient. And then he had documented it and protected the record and refused to let the truth be reclassified into something more manageable. That was it. That was the whole of it. The bolt sat in the case on the wall, small and silver gray and completely ordinary looking, the way most important things looked when you hadn't yet understood what they were. Ethan picked up his folder from the chair where he'd set it and walked out of the training room and went back to work. There were inspections scheduled for the afternoon. There were components to certify and records to review, and a system that was new enough to still be finding its shape, still being tested against the pressure that institutional momentum always applied to the structures trying to hold it accountable. The work was not finished. In the particular sense that mattered most, it was never finished. It just continued, detail by detail, record by record, in the hands of people who understood that the decision to look carefully at a small thing was not a small decision at all. He had learned that before any of this happened. It had taken the rest of the world a while to catch up. The hallway was full of ordinary morning noise, keyboards, a conversation near the coffee station, someone's phone ringing twice before going to voicemail. Ethan walked through it all and felt, not satisfaction exactly, but the specific, grounded steadiness of a person who knew what they were doing and why, and who understood that this was, in the end, enough.